picture this. January 17, 1946. A snow-covered field hospital near Krakow, Poland, where Allied medical personnel continue treating victims of 6 years of occupation, warfare, and atrocity that killed millions and left survivors traumatized beyond anything peacetime medicine had prepared them to address. Captain Helen Kowalski, a 34-year-old U.S. Army nurse from Chicago's Polish community, tends to displaced persons in a medical tent that serves as triage center for refugees streaming westward from Soviet-controlled territories. At 15:34 hours, she radios Medical Command in Frankfurt, confirming safe processing of another transport and estimating closure of the temporary field station within 3 days. At 15:37 hours, a Polish resistance fighter approaches Kowalski with urgent message about wounded partisans hidden in a forest location, men who'd fought against both German and Soviet occupation, but who couldn't seek treatment at official facilities where Soviet authorities might identify them as anti-communist insurgents. At 15:42 hours, Kowalski makes the decision that will define her fate. She tells her medical team she's conducting assessment of reported casualties, taking supplies in case immediate treatment is needed, and estimating return within 4 hours. For 79 years, Captain Helen Kowalski will not return from that Polish forest. Search parties sent when she fails to reach the field hospital will find the location she described, but no evidence of Kowalski or the wounded partisans she went to help. Just winter silence and snow covering tracks that led into trees and never led out. Until 2025, when Polish environmental surveyors mapping old-growth forest for preservation discover that a section of supposedly natural terrain conceals structures built during wartime, finding a medical tent preserved beneath decades of soil and vegetation, containing equipment from 1946, documents in Kowalski's handwriting, and evidence that she didn't die on that January day. She discovered something that 3 governments had spent 79 years ensuring stayed buried beneath Polish soil and post-war reconstruction. Helen Kowalski wasn't supposed to be in Poland. Her assignment had been Germany, working in hospitals treating American occupation forces and German civilians during the chaotic transition from warfare to uneasy peace. But in December 1945, when Medical Command requested volunteers for temporary duty in Poland addressing humanitarian crisis created by millions of displaced persons, refugees, and survivors of camps and ghettos, Kowalski had stepped forward immediately. Her motivations were personal as much as professional. Born in Chicago to Polish immigrant parents who'd fled economic hardship in the 1920s, she'd grown up speaking Polish at home and English in public, maintaining connections to a culture that her parents had left but never abandoned emotionally. When Nazi Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, starting the war that would consume Europe for 6 years, Kowalski had watched from America as the country of her heritage was brutalized by occupiers from both West and East. She'd joined the Army Nurse Corps in 1942, trained at military hospitals stateside, and deployed to Europe in 1944 after D-Day landings created massive casualties requiring every available medical professional. Her wartime service had been primarily in France and Germany, treating combat casualties and then transition injuries as warfare gave way to occupation. But throughout those years, she'd been preparing for the opportunity to serve in Poland, to use her language skills and cultural knowledge to help survivors of occupation that had been particularly savage in its implementation. Her letters home to her parents in Chicago, preserved by her family and donated to medical archives in 2019, documented her experiences during those final months of 1945 and early weeks of 1946. In December 1945, she'd written words that her parents would reread obsessively for decades. "The devastation here is beyond anything I witnessed in Germany. Warsaw is rubble, villages are empty shells, and the people, the survivors, they're traumatized in ways that will take generations to heal. But the political situation makes everything more complicated. The Soviets control Poland now, and they're not interested in helping anyone they view as politically unreliable. Former resistance fighters who fought Nazis are being arrested as threats to the new communist order. People who survived camps are being denied assistance because their pre-war affiliations are deemed suspicious. And medical personnel like me are caught between humanitarian obligations and political realities that make helping certain people dangerous for everyone involved. Her final letter, mailed on January 15th, contained observations that would haunt investigators for 79 years. I'm hearing reports about wounded partisans hiding in forests around Krakow. These are men who fought against German occupation, but who also opposed Soviet takeover. They can't seek treatment at official facilities because Soviet security services are looking for them. Some are dying of wounds that basic medical care could treat. I'm being approached by people asking if American nurses would help, if the Hippocratic Oath applies to casualties that politics has made invisible. I don't know what I should do. Military regulations say I should report these requests to command. But medical ethics say I should assess the situation and provide care if it's needed and if it's safe to do so. The field hospital near Krakow, where Kowalski was serving, had been established in November 1945 as part of Allied efforts to address the humanitarian crisis in post-war Poland. The facility was technically under joint Allied-Soviet authority, but practical control rested with Soviet officials who were increasingly suspicious of Western personnel they viewed as potential intelligence agents or political subversives who might undermine communist consolidation of power. Kowalski's decision to investigate the report about wounded partisans on January 17th had been made based on information from a Polish contact named Piotr, a former resistance fighter who'd approached the American medical tent claiming that a dozen men were hiding in a forest location approximately 10 kilometers from Krakow, suffering from wounds sustained in clashes with Soviet security forces, but unable to seek official treatment without being arrested. Piotr had pleaded for American medical assistance, arguing that nurses from Western countries were the only medical professionals whom partisan groups trusted not to inform Soviet authorities about their locations. Kowalski had been torn, understanding that responding to this request violated protocols requiring coordination with Soviet officials, but also recognizing that medical ethics required assessing whether casualties needed treatment regardless of political complications their care might create. She'd reported Piotr's information to her commanding officer, Major David Walsh, who'd told her that providing medical care to anti-Soviet partisans would create diplomatic incidents that could jeopardize the entire Allied medical mission in Poland. But Kowalski had argued that conducting reconnaissance to determine whether casualties actually existed was different from providing treatment, that if wounded men were indeed dying in forest locations, then American Medical Command needed to know about the situation even if political considerations prevented direct intervention. Major Walsh had reluctantly authorized a 4-hour reconnaissance mission, giving Kowalski permission to assess the situation and report back. If wounded partisans existed and required immediate medical intervention to prevent death, Walsh would contact Soviet authorities requesting humanitarian access. But Kowalski was to conduct only assessment, not treatment, and was to withdraw immediately if the situation appeared dangerous or if Soviet forces were operating in the area. Kowalski had departed the field hospital at approximately 15:45 hours on January 17th, accompanied by Piotr, who was guiding her to the forest location. According to statements given by medical personnel who'd watched them leave, Kowalski had carried basic medical supplies, warm clothing for winter conditions, and a radio for communication with the hospital. She'd estimated return by 1945 hours, allowing time to reach the forest, conduct assessment, and report findings to Major Walsh. When 1945 hours passed with no communication from Kowalski, Major Walsh attempted radio contact. No response. By 2015 hours, he'd organized a search party that reached the forest location Piotr had described by 21:47 hours. They found it exactly as reported, a clearing in dense woods showing signs of recent occupation. But Kowalski wasn't there. Neither was Piotr. The clearing showed evidence that people had been living there temporarily, makeshift shelters and fire pits suggesting partisan encampment, but no indication of where those people had gone or what had happened after Kowalski had arrived. The search party explored the surrounding forest throughout the night, calling Kowalski's name repeatedly, listening for responses that never came. They examined the clearing for evidence of struggle, forced departure, or anything explaining her disappearance. They found minimal conclusive evidence. The snow had been disturbed by multiple people walking in various directions, but tracks became impossible to follow once they entered denser forest where overhead trees prevented snow accumulation. Major Walsh reported Kowalski's disappearance to both American and Soviet military authorities. Soviet officers were contacted, asked if their forces had detained American medical personnel for any reason. They denied knowledge of Kowalski or operations in the forest area. Polish civilians in nearby villages were interviewed about Piotr and about partisan activities. Most claimed ignorance, though elderly residents acknowledged that resistance fighters had been using forests around Krakow throughout the occupation and that some groups continued operating against Soviet authorities despite the war's official end. The official investigation continued through February 1946, complicated by deteriorating relations between Western allies and Soviet authorities who were increasingly uncooperative with American investigators operating in territories they viewed as their exclusive sphere of influence. The investigation concluded with a report acknowledging only uncertainty. Kowalski had entered the forest and hadn't emerged. No evidence suggested she'd been killed, captured, or evacuated through means investigators could detect. The most likely explanation, authorities reluctantly concluded, was that she'd been detained by Soviet security forces who weren't acknowledging the detention for political reasons, or that she'd been killed by partisans or bandits operating in lawless areas where central authority hadn't been fully re-established. Kowalski's parents were notified that their daughter was missing in action, presumed killed while providing medical assistance. They spent the rest of their lives searching for answers, writing to military authorities, contacting Polish officials, even hiring investigators after immigration to America became possible in the 1980s. They died in the early 1990s, still believing that someone knew more about Helen's fate than they'd admitted, that their daughter's disappearance involved something beyond simple accident or random violence in post-war chaos. For 79 years, the forest near Krakow remained largely unchanged, its old-growth trees protected by conservation policies that prevented commercial development. The area transitioned through decades of communist rule, through solidarity movements challenged to that rule, through Poland's integration into democratic Europe. And through all these transformations, the forest kept its secrets, holding evidence of what had happened to Captain Helen Kowalski on January 17, 1946. In 2024, Polish environmental authorities began comprehensive surveys of protected forests, mapping old-growth areas to better understand their ecological value and to document historical uses that might inform conservation strategies. The survey team, working near Krakow, used ground-penetrating radar and other modern technologies to examine terrain beneath forest canopy. On December 3, 2024, they detected an anomaly in the area where Kowalski had vanished 79 years earlier. A section of supposedly natural terrain showed characteristics suggesting artificial structures beneath accumulated soil and vegetation. Further investigation revealed that what appeared to be a small hill was actually a collapsed tent structure, deliberately buried and camouflaged but preserved by soil conditions that had protected materials from complete decomposition. Polish authorities contacted American military attachés, informed them about the discovery, and asked whether the buried structure might contain wartime materials requiring careful handling. Archival searches revealed Kowalski's disappearance and its connection to this forest location. Both Polish and American governments agreed that the site should be carefully excavated to determine what it contained and whether it provided answers to an 80-year-old mystery. On January 17, 2025, exactly 79 years after Kowalski's disappearance, excavation specialists carefully removed layers of soil and vegetation, revealing a medical tent that had been deliberately preserved, sealed against weather and time, containing equipment from 1946 and documents that would finally explain what Captain Helen Kowalski had discovered on that January day. The medical tent had been preserved with extraordinary care, sealed in conditions that protected materials from complete decomposition, despite 79 years buried beneath Polish forest soil. Polish and American investigation teams carefully excavated layers of earth and vegetation, revealing a structure approximately 12 meters long and 8 meters wide, containing medical equipment, surgical instruments, and documentation that told a story investigators hadn't anticipated discovering. The tent's interior organization suggested it had served as fully functional medical facility rather than temporary shelter. One section contained operating tables, sterilization equipment, and surgical instruments that matched what field hospitals used in 1946. But another section held patient records, treatment logs, and documentation suggesting this facility had been treating casualties whose medical needs transcended what official military or civilian hospitals could provide given political constraints of immediate post-war period. The investigation team's first discovery was a nurse's logbook near the tent's entrance, containing entries in Helen Kowalski's distinctive handwriting. The logbook began on January 17, 1946, at 16:07 hours, just minutes after Kowalski had entered the forest following Piotr's guidance. Arrived at partisan encampment as described. Piotr led me to medical tent hidden beneath trees and camouflaged with natural materials. This isn't improvised shelter. It's organized treatment facility, staffed by Polish physicians and nurses who've been operating here since German retreat. They're treating wounded partisans who fought against both Nazi and Soviet occupation, men who can't seek care at official hospitals where authorities would identify them as anti-communist insurgents and arrest them. The subsequent entries documented what happened during Kowalski's first hours in the facility, revelations that explained everything about her disappearance. 1,734 hours. I've examined 12 patients here. Most have gunshot wounds from recent clashes with Soviet security forces. Some have injuries that are weeks old, becoming infected because they couldn't risk seeking treatment. The medical staff here is skilled but undersupplied. They're performing surgery with instruments sterilized in boiling water because they don't have access to proper autoclaves. They're using bandages made from torn sheets because medical supplies are controlled by Soviet authorities who won't provide them to facilities treating political criminals. Kowalski's logbook revealed her growing understanding that the forest medical facility represented something far more extensive than single treatment center. 1847 hours. Dr. Maria Nowak, the physician coordinating this facility, has explained that this is one node in a network extending across Poland. Medical professionals who served in resistance during German occupation have continued operating in secret, providing care to casualties that Soviet authorities consider enemies of the state. They're treating former Home Army fighters, anti-communist partisans, civilians fleeing Soviet-controlled territories, and anyone else who needs medical assistance but whom political considerations make invisible to official healthcare systems. The logbook documented Kowalski's internal struggle with this revelation over hours spent in the tent throughout the evening of January 17th. Dr. Nowak had explained that Polish medical professionals had been coordinating throughout the war and post-war transition, creating underground healthcare networks that operated outside Soviet control. The networks provided treatment to casualties whose political affiliations made them ineligible for care at official facilities, and they depended on supplies smuggled from Western-controlled areas and on assistance from medical personnel like Kowalski, who had access to resources that Polish underground couldn't obtain through official channels. But Kowalski's logbook also documented her discovery that the underground medical network involved accepting enormous risks. January 17, 2,247 hours. I've been here 11 hours now. Dr. Nowak has shown me the reality of what they're doing. They're saving lives that Soviet authorities want ended. They're preserving resistance capabilities that communist officials are trying to eliminate. And they're doing all of this knowing that if they're discovered, they'll be executed not as criminals but as traitors to the new Polish state. Every patient they treat, every supply they accept, every connection they maintain with Western medical personnel creates evidence that could destroy everyone involved. Kowalski had been given the same choice that other Western medical professionals had faced when they discovered underground healthcare operations. Leave, report finding abandoned partisan encampment with no current occupants and return to her unit. Or remain as American liaison, providing supplies and coordination while monitoring the network to ensure its operations didn't create diplomatic incidents that might jeopardize larger Allied interests in post-war Poland. Kowalski's decision, documented in entries from January 18th through January 20th, explained why she'd never returned to the field hospital. January 20th, 15:34 hours. I'm staying. Not because I've been coerced or because I no longer value American interests. Because I believe medical care that serves healing regardless of political affiliation honors nursing ethics more truly than field hospital work that treats only casualties deemed politically acceptable by occupation authorities. I'll serve as American liaison, providing supplies and coordination while ensuring this network doesn't become vehicle for anti-Soviet operations that would compromise U.S.-Soviet relations. The investigation team found extensive evidence that Kowalski had indeed remained in the forest facility and broader underground network for years after her reported disappearance. A second logbook, covering the period from 1946 to 1954, revealed that Kowalski had lived in various locations across Poland, coordinating medical supplies, training underground healthcare workers, and occasionally treating patients when her nursing skills were needed for complex cases. This second logbook painted a detailed picture of Kowalski's life in the underground network during early Cold War years, moving between safe houses and forest facilities, never staying in one location long enough that patterns might alert Soviet security services, coordinating with American military medical personnel who smuggled supplies through official channels, documenting them as destroyed or lost to avoid accountability, training Polish nurses and physicians in techniques she'd learned treating combat casualties, adapting military medicine for underground application where resources were scarce and sterilization was improvised. The logbook documented several crises where Kowalski's role had been crucial. In 1947, when Soviet authorities discovered one underground facility and arrested its staff, Kowalski had helped evacuate patients to other locations before security forces could identify them. In 1949, when anti-communist resistance intensified and casualties overwhelmed underground medical capacity, Kowalski had coordinated emergency supply deliveries that prevented deaths from treatable wounds becoming fatal due to lack of basic medical materials. In 1951, when Stalin's paranoia about Western espionage led to crackdowns on anyone suspected of maintaining contact with Allied personnel, Kowalski had helped restructure the network to operate with minimal Western contact, ensuring care could continue even if American supply lines were compromised. And in 1953, when Stalin's death created uncertainty about Soviet policies, Kowalski had participated in cautious outreach to see whether underground medical operations might transition to official status under more liberal Polish government. But the logbook also documented immense personal costs: complete isolation from family in Chicago who believed she'd died, inability to maintain identity as Helen Kowalski, living instead under series of false names that changed whenever security considerations required relocating, growing awareness that her parents were aging and dying without knowing she'd survived, that her absence was causing pain she couldn't alleviate without compromising network that served purposes she believed justified personal sacrifice. The entries from early 1950s showed a woman wrestling with exhaustion and moral doubt. April 23, 1953. I've been underground 7 years. 7 years of treating wounds that official histories don't acknowledge exist, saving lives that communist authorities want ended, serving purposes that transcend nations but which require living without nationality, without identity, without connections to anything except the work. Dr. Nowak argues that we're preserving medical ethics in a world where politics corrupts everything, including healing professions. But I'm exhausted. and I'm increasingly convinced that serving principles while abandoning people creates isolation that corrupts as surely as political compromise corrupts. The logbook revealed that Kowalski had requested release from network duties in 1954, arguing that she'd served longer than most Western liaisons and that Polish medical professionals were capable of operating independently now that supply networks had been established and training had been completed. The network's coordinating committee had agreed, with conditions reflecting both appreciation for her service and recognition that Westerners who'd served too long underground sometimes became liabilities rather than assets if their isolation made them psychologically unstable. She'd be given new identity, relocated to a Western country, and provided with support, allowing her to work in civilian medicine. She'd maintained contact with network coordinators throughout her life, available for consultation when complex cases required her expertise. But she'd no longer serve actively in facilities that existed in shadows between official healthcare and clandestine resistance. Kowalski's final logbook entry was dated September 7, 1954. Tomorrow I leave Poland. I'll become Catherine Walsh, Irish nurse who emigrated from Europe after working with displaced persons during post-war chaos. The identity is plausible. Documentation shows me employed at facilities that existed but which kept minimal records during occupation and reconstruction. I'll live in Dublin, work in civilian hospitals if credentials can be arranged, and try to build life from fragments of identities I've abandoned. My parents will never know I survived. My nursing colleagues from Chicago will never learn what became of me. And I'll spend remaining years wondering if saving lives in Polish forests justified abandoning the family who needed to know I hadn't died providing care to strangers. The investigation team found documentation of Kowalski's reintegration in files that underground network successors had maintained through decades of political transformation. She'd lived in Dublin under her assumed identity from 1954 until her death in 2002 at age 90. She'd worked as emergency room nurse at Mater Misericordiae University Hospital, earned reputation for exceptional skill with trauma cases, and maintained low profile despite insights into treating injuries that few civilian nurses understood. She'd never married, never formed close relationships requiring explanation of gaps in her history, and never revealed her actual identity even to colleagues who became friends over decades. She'd maintained contact with Polish underground network coordinators throughout her life, even after Solidarity movement and Poland's transition to democracy made underground operations unnecessary. And significantly, she'd written a memoir in her final years, intended for eventual release explaining what the underground medical network had been and why she'd believed serving it honored nursing ethics more truly than conventional military medicine. That memoir, discovered among documents in the preserved tent, provided the most comprehensive explanation of underground healthcare during early Cold War that investigators had ever received. Kowalski argued that medical ethics required treating all patients regardless of political affiliation, that healthcare systems that excluded casualties based on ideology betrayed medicine's fundamental principles. The underground network had been Polish medical professionals' attempt to preserve healing as primary objective even when communist authorities viewed medicine primarily as tool for supporting regime and eliminating opposition. She acknowledged moral complications, arguments that could be made that she'd betrayed her military oath by supporting anti-Soviet resistance and by operating outside official channels. But she also argued that refusing medical care based on political considerations was itself betrayal of deeper ethical obligations, that nursing oaths transcended military service when the two came into conflict. The most poignant documents in the tent were letters Kowalski had written to her parents throughout her years underground and in Dublin, letters she'd never sent but which documented her continuing connection to family she'd abandoned. The letters explained her choices, described her work treating casualties that communist authorities wanted dead, and asked forgiveness for pain her disappearance had caused. The final letter, dated August 15, 2001, just months before Kowalski's death, contained words that would haunt everyone who read them. Mama, Tata, if you're reading this, Someone discovered these letters after my death and decided you deserved truth despite security classifications. I disappeared in 1946 because I found medical work that transcended political boundaries and made a choice that I spent 55 years questioning. I became Catherine Walsh and lived a life that had meaning, but which was built on deception that corrupted everything, including the relationships I claimed to value. I treated wounded from resistance that historians barely acknowledge while abandoning the parents who needed to know I hadn't died in Polish forest. Whether that exchange was justified, whether the lives I saved balanced the pain I caused, I honestly don't know. I chose nursing ethics over family loyalty, and I paid for that choice every day since January 1946. The Polish government's response to the tense discovery followed now familiar patterns. The site was classified at highest security levels, contents were cataloged under protocols ensuring minimal access, and diplomatic consultations were held with American and other governments about handling evidence of arrangements none had publicly acknowledged. Consensus emerged that the facility would be described as partisan medical shelter from immediate post-war period, now of historical interest, and that truth about underground medical network and Kowalski's fate would remain partially classified. But Kowalski's family was contacted, given information authorities determined was deserved and safe. In May 2025, her nephew's granddaughter, Anna, received notification from U.S. Army Nurse Corps. Captain Kowalski had disappeared in 1946, but not through capture or accident. She'd discovered an underground medical facility, had remained to provide coordination under circumstances requiring her official death, and had lived until 2002 under assumed identity in Ireland. Anna was given access to some of Kowalski's letters, written to her parents but never sent, documenting her life as Catherine Walsh and her enduring connection to family she'd abandoned. She was shown portions of Kowalski's memoir, explaining her choices and principles she'd believed justified sacrificing personal identity. And she was told, in carefully crafted language, that her great-great-aunt had served purposes transcending military medicine, that her sacrifice had contributed to preserving medical ethics during period when political considerations corrupted healthcare, and that she'd never stopped regretting pain her disappearance had caused. The forest site was sealed after excavation, with a memorial marker installed acknowledging that American military nurse Helen Kowalski had disappeared at this location in 1946, giving her life in service to medical ideals that authorities still considered sensitive. But among those few who knew complete truth, who'd read Kowalski's logbooks and understood what underground medical network represented, there was acknowledgement that post-war medical history was more complex than public narratives suggested, that some medical professionals had served purposes transcending official healthcare, that preserving medical ethics had sometimes required operations outside government control, and that the line between serving military interests and serving medical principles had been contested in ways that simple classifications of loyalty and betrayal couldn't capture. Captain Helen Kowalski had walked into a Polish forest on January 17, 1946, and vanished into a world where medical care transcended political boundaries and communist control. She'd spent 8 years underground and 48 years in Ireland carrying secrets that would remain buried for 79 years before being partially revealed to descendants who struggled to understand why their relative had chosen medical ethics over family, healing over nationality, and exile over recognition for service that official histories would never acknowledge. The dark secrets revealed in the Polish forest tent weren't crimes, but choices. Not betrayals, but sacrifices made by medical professionals who believed that the Hippocratic Oath required commitments that political systems couldn't accommodate. Whether those commitments were justified, whether Kowalski's choice was ethical, those remained questions without simple answers. But for Anna and others who learned their relatives' fates, there was understanding that disappearance had meant something beyond death, that sacrifice had served purposes transcending nations, and that sometimes greatest service involved giving up everything to protect principles that no government owned but all humanity needed preserved. This story was intense, but this one on the right is even more insane. You won't believe what they uncovered.